Tokyo, Japan, January 17, 1940. The air in the Imperial Naval General Staff Office, deep within the heart of Tokyo, was thick with the scent of dried ink, imported pipe tobacco, and the faint, metallic aroma of freshly sharpened graphite. Outside, the Japanese winter pressed in, quiet and relentless, but here, beneath the heavy polished wood of the conference table, the atmosphere was charged with a contained, fervent ambition. The sound that dominated this clandestine planning session was not the roar of engines or the clang of steel, but the incessant, dry click-click-click of abacus beads manipulated by the swift, practiced fingers of logistics officers. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, precise and severe in his crisp white uniform, adjusted a sheaf of documents bound with red silk cord. His gaze rested on a map of the Pacific, a vast canvas of blue and brown already annotated with the bold, aggressive strokes of projected conquest. The American naval presence, personified by the distant, slow-moving fleet in Pearl Harbor, was represented not by actual strength, but by a meticulously calculated statistical assessment of its potential vulnerability. The figure, derived from the most comprehensive estimates of the U.S. Navy's standing peacetime establishment, its recruitment cycles, and its projected mobilization capacity over an 18-month conflict, was read aloud. 296,000 uniformed sailors. This was the maximum effective combat force, the true limit of America's ability to man and maintain a two-ocean war while facing the supposed decadent softness of its domestic character. It was a fixed, definable constraint, a quantitative edge, against which the relentless, self-sacrificing spirit of the Imperial Navy was expected to triumph. It was a number, coolly delivered, that sealed their strategic doctrine. It was the estimated manpower ceiling of a republic they believed was too fat, too comfortable, and too distracted by its own peacetime abundance to field a truly oceanic military force. Historical context. This precise numerical assessment, 296,000, was not a random guess, but the bedrock of the entire Japanese strategic philosophy. It was the mathematical expression of Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy had planned for a single, climactic engagement with the American fleet. Their strategy relied not on the capacity to outproduce the United States, an industrial impossibility they acknowledged, but on the capacity to inflict such a catastrophic, disproportionate loss early in the conflict that the American will to fight would break. The logic was fatally linear. America, they calculated, was a nation of shopkeepers, farmers, and factory workers, not warriors. The vast Pacific distance would strain U.S. logistics to the breaking point. The loss of a critical percentage of its trained professional sailor corps, the 296,000 cadre, would be irreplaceable within the short time frame required for Japan to consolidate its conquests across Southeast Asia and the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. They bet the fate of the empire on a psychological constraint, not a material one. They assumed a finite pool of available, willing, and trained manpower, believing that the American people would recoil from the sacrifice necessary to replace such a profound, concentrated loss of life. The Japanese strategists viewed their own manpower as infinitely renewable, driven by a national ideology of Bushido and spiritual superiority. They saw the American sailor as an industrial accessory, a cog in a material machine. The war, they believed, would be won in the early months before the lumbering, peacetime giant could awaken and retool. The 296,000 was a ceiling, a known quantity that could be shattered. What they failed to account for was not merely the capacity of American factories, but the unfettered, explosive capacity of the American citizenry. They failed to comprehend the immediate, unhesitating conversion of an entire nation from a philosophy of leisure to a philosophy of total, industrial-scale war. Third, emotional contrast. The disparity between expectation and reality began not with the clang of steel, but with a simple, discarded glass bottle. The Japanese sailors, indoctrinated since childhood in the austerity and purity of the imperial cause, expected the American foe to be a worthy but ultimately beatable adversary, a professional force that, once crippled, would retreat into its continental shell. They expected to face men of similar, limited vintage, drawn from a defined, established naval reserve pool. What they encountered first at Midway and then with brutal clarity in the tropical hellscape of Guadalcanal was something entirely different. A vast, seemingly inexhaustible tide of material and human beings. For the Japanese troops slogging through the jungle mud of Guadalcanal, expecting to find the weary, isolated remnants of a depleted garrison, the shock was profound. They were used to fighting with what they could carry, their supply lines stretched to the absolute limit, facing shortages of rice, quinine, and ammunition. They were fighting a war of diminishing returns. Then, they would overrun a recently abandoned American position. There, amid the detritus of a foe who fought not with ascetic discipline, but with an almost arrogant carelessness of supply, lay the evidence of an entirely different kind of society. Not merely canned rations, not merely machine gun belts measured in thousands of rounds, but small, perfect, uniform objects discarded without a second thought. This object, found in the sand, crushed beneath a tank track, or floating gently in a muddy stream, became the symbol of their undoing, the Coca-Cola bottle. It was standardized, perfectly formed, designed for immediate, cheap, mass-market consumption. It represented a civilization that could produce something so utterly non-essential, yet so universally desirable, and distribute it globally with such casual, overwhelming ease that its empty vessel became mere litter on a remote, blood-soaked Pacific island. The Japanese soldier, often subsisting on mere water and a handful of captured crackers, looked at the discarded bottle, a vessel for sugary luxury, and realized the scale of the error. The contrast was not merely between two armies, but between two utterly different economic universes, one defined by brutal scarcity, the other by incomprehensible, almost wasteful abundance. The foe they faced was not 296,000 professional sailors. It was the entire, unconstrained industrial might represented by every perfect curve of that ubiquitous glass. 4. Historical evidence, the unlocking of the reservoir. The 296,000 estimate was broken the moment the Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. It was rendered obsolete not by an act of military genius, but by an act of democratic will. Before the war, the U.S. Navy's personnel count had hovered near the 250,000 mark. Within 18 months of the declaration of war, the numbers exploded past any Japanese calculation. The mobilization of the American human resource was a phenomenon without parallel in history, transforming the nation's entire demographic profile. The Great Lakes Naval Training Station, along with boot camps at Bainbridge, Maryland and San Diego, California, became the human equivalent of Henry Ford's assembly line. These were not the slow, bespoke training grounds of pre-war European militaries. These were processing centers. Men arrived by the trainload, young, untested, fresh from the farms of Iowa, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, and the offices of New York. They were stripped of their civilian identity and, within 12 to 16 weeks, fitted with the basic skills of war. The scale of this human mobilization is the definitive statistical evidence that shattered the Japanese strategic premise. By the end of 1941, the U.S. Navy had approximately 325,000 personnel. This was already slightly over the Japanese estimate, but within the bounds of expected, if aggressive, mobilization. By the end of 1942, after just 12 months of total war, 1.5 million personnel. By the end of 1943, 2.5 million personnel. And by the climactic stages of the Pacific War, mid-1945, The U.S. Navy reached its peak strength of nearly 3.4 million sailors, officers, and enlisted men and women, waves. This represented an increase of nearly 1,150% over the Japanese estimated ceiling. For every one American sailor, the Japanese strategists calculated they were facing 11. This raw numerical reality was compounded by the speed of material replacement. The naval war was defined by attrition, particularly of aircraft carriers. The Japanese assumed that the loss of 2 or 3 frontline carriers would cripple the American Pacific effort for years. They did not account for the sheer, brutal pace of the U.S. industrial naval complex. The Essex-class carrier program is the definitive proof of this mobilization. Conceived for mass production and standardization, an Essex carrier, a 27,000-ton behemoth, could be delivered from keel laying to commissioning in as little as 14 months. Between 1942 and 1946, 24 of these carriers were completed and commissioned, a constant, inexorable stream of floating airfields that rendered Japanese losses utterly irrelevant. When Admiral Chester Nimitz lost the USS Lexington at Coral Sea, the Japanese believed it a victory with lasting consequences. When Nimitz lost the USS Yorktown at Midway, the loss was considered potentially decisive. What the Japanese failed to grasp was that for every Yorktown that sank, a dozen new flat tops, faster, better armed, and infinitely more resilient, were already sliding down the ways at shipyards the Japanese didn't even know existed. The same principles of standardization and overproduction that created the ubiquitous, perfectly consistent Coca-Cola bottle were applied to the most complex machine of war. The American philosophy was not about careful tactical preservation. It was about overwhelming, casual replacement. Losses were merely a scheduling problem, not a strategic catastrophe. Transformation, the psychological impact of infinity. The true battleground was not the ocean surface, but the psychological landscape of the imperial command. The Japanese military mind was trained to calculate risk based on fixed, quantifiable resources. The American war machine defied quantification. It behaved like an infinite resource loop. The shock was first evident not in official communiques, but in the field reports and diaries of mid-level Japanese officers fighting in the Solomons. They spoke of the enemy's insensitivity to loss. One captured document from a Japanese naval air pilot, dated late 1943, near Rabaul, contained a chilling, reflective passage that captured the transformation of perception. "We downed 12 bombers yesterday. We saw them crash and burn in the sea, an act of valor, an act that cost us 2 of our best. But today, the sky is full again. The reports say 25 this morning. Where do they come from? They are not the same pilots. They are not the same machines. It is like trying to stop the ocean with a bamboo screen. Our strategy was built on a wall, but they are an endless tide. They treat their losses as we treat old newspapers." This sentiment of confronting an endless tide was the catalyst for the psychological breakdown of the Japanese fighting will. The concept of gyokusai, shattering like a jewel, emerged precisely because the traditional path to victory, crippling the enemy's resource base, was impossible. The only viable path left to the Japanese was to inflict such horrific, costly damage that the American public, not the military command, would quit. But even this hope was eroded by the logistical indifference demonstrated by the American forces. The American logistics tail, the train of supply ships, repair tenders, fueling tankers, and hospital ships, was so vast that it redefined the very concept of warfare in the Pacific. For every combat vessel, there were multiple auxiliary ships. While the Japanese struggled to get enough fuel for a one-way sortie, the American fleet operated on a rotational basis, the oilers and stores ships constantly replenishing the task forces mid-ocean, allowing them to remain on station indefinitely. The American sailor had access to fresh food, clean water, immediate medical care, and mail, a constant psychological anchor to the abundance of home. And everywhere, the evidence of this excess was scattered, the empty, gleaming, brown glass of the Coca-Cola bottle. It was discarded not because it was empty, but because another was immediately available. It was a tangible, universal representation of a production system that valued output and convenience over scarcity and conservation. To the Japanese, who had scraped and saved every ounce of metal and drop of oil for the war effort, this casual waste was not a weakness, but a terrifying sign of untrammeled power. It suggested a nation so fundamentally wealthy, so structurally abundant, that their entire war effort was simply a momentary, expensive distraction from the norm of their consumer life. The Japanese High Command realized, too late, that their 296,000 estimate was based on a fundamental misreading of the American character. They saw a peacetime force. They failed to see a people who, once unified by the shock of attack, could convert their entire vast economic infrastructure into a single-purpose, human-processing, war-fighting machine. The sailors were not merely recruits. They were the temporary retooling of the American population itself. Sixter symbolism, the arc of the glass bottle. The Coca-Cola bottle served as a recurring, silent witness to the Japanese defeat, its meaning evolving throughout the conflict. Phase 1. The miscalculation, 1940-1941. The bottle, in this period, was known to Japanese intelligence only as an object of American cultural decadence, the sugary symbol of a weak, soft people preoccupied with trivial comforts. Its production was evidence of industrial effort wasted on non-essential consumer goods, confirming the strategy of the decisive blow. Phase 2. The Revelation, 1942-1943. Found shattered on the beaches of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Bougainville, the bottle transformed into a symbol of unlimited supply. It was litter in a war zone, signifying an enemy who could afford to waste industrial product in the face of absolute scarcity. The logistics required to deliver a soft drink to a frontline soldier spoke to a supply chain so robust that military necessities were merely one item on a manifest that included luxuries. Phase 3. The Psychological Weapon, 1944-1945. By the time the Americans pressed towards the Philippines and Okinawa, the bottle was no longer just garbage. It was a psychological weapon. Captured Japanese soldiers, demoralized and suffering from extreme starvation, would be shown American rations. The sheer variety, the cleanliness of the packaging, and the occasional presence of a newly bottled Coke became almost unbearable evidence of the industrial gap. One documented interview with a captured engineer on Saipan revealed the depth of this realization. He did not speak of the American battleships, which were expected, but of the logistical infrastructure. We saw the ships in the harbor. They were unloading trucks in the thousands. And the food? We watched them throwing away the cans that still had food inside because the soldier did not like the flavor that day. We saw the empty bottles. We knew we were finished. A country that can afford to make the waste we witnessed cannot be beaten. We were taught to save everything. They were taught to replace everything. Their civilian life became their military advantage. The 296,000 estimate was based on counting the sailors. The reality was that they should have counted the number of bottling plants, the steel mills, the automotive factories, and the millions of citizen soldiers, men and women, willing to temporarily put down the products of their peacetime economy to defend the system that created them. The American fighting force was not a specialized elite. It was the entire mobilized mass of the world's greatest industrial power, casually dressed in naval whites. 7. Transformation of perception and ideology. The ultimate casualty of the Japanese 296,000 miscalculation was not military personnel, but imperial ideology. The belief in spiritual superiority, in the transformative power of Bushido over material science, was systematically dismantled by the relentless arrival of new ships, new planes, and new men. The Japanese ideology held that a warrior's will, honed by tradition and self-sacrifice, could defeat a technologically superior but morally and physically soft enemy. The American war effort proved that a democracy, when threatened, could harness its freedom and its capacity for individual choice and redirect it into a massive, organized, and utterly efficient war effort, an efficiency that far exceeded the rigid controls of the totalitarian state. The core ideological transformation was the realization that the American system was not soft, it was elastic. The Japanese system was brittle, designed for one decisive punch. Once the carrier fleet was lost at Midway, the entire machine began to seize up, unable to replace the lost pilots, unable to source the materials, unable to find the oil. The entire supply chain was dependent on overseas resources that were now cut off. The system had no redundancy. The American system, by contrast, was built on inherent redundancy and civilian adaptability. The same machinery that made cars made tanks. The same workers who built refrigerators built ships. The sailors who manned the fleet were not a lifelong caste. They were temporary transfers from the great pool of American vocational and industrial skill. They had the innate mechanical literacy to operate complex equipment and the civilian expectation of efficiency and organization. They were, in essence, highly effective temporary industrial workers operating naval vessels. This realization that the American combat machine was merely the wartime expression of its peacetime economy was the true psychological breaking point. The 296,000 estimate was replaced by the terrifying, unquantifiable truth. The enemy was essentially limitless. They were facing not an army, but a self-replenishing economic reality. This was vividly reflected in the desperate late-war calls for kamikaze attacks. The shift from a strategy of maneuver and attrition to a strategy of suicidal single-strike damage was the direct admission that the material and manpower fight could no longer be won. It was the final tragic surrender of logistics to spirit, a recognition that the only way to slow the American advance was through acts so shocking they might briefly paralyze the foe. It was the proof that the American will had not been broken, but the Japanese estimation of its size had. The American soldier, sailor, and airman, carrying the democratic expectation of comfort, convenience, and abundance, carried within him an implicit threat of overwhelming industrial power. He was 3.4 million, not 296,000. He came in a ship built in record time, fueled by unlimited oil, and, tucked into his sea bag, was the silent, ubiquitous symbol of his homeland's capacity, the Coca-Cola bottle. Fate, the final stages, and inevitability. As the war entered its final bloody phases, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the constant relentless air raids on the Japanese home islands, the weight of this logistical and human disparity became physically crushing. On the home front, the Japanese civilian population was reduced to near starvation, utilizing wood and paper for aircraft and rationing every ounce of steel. Meanwhile, American war production continued unabated, exceeding 1944 records in certain key areas. The sheer inertia of the American economy, once directed at war, was unstoppable. For the Japanese defenders in the caves of Iwo Jima, the constant, coordinated bombardment was not just a military action. It was an act of industrial terror. They endured the largest naval and air shelling in the history of the Pacific, delivered by a fleet that had the fuel, the ammunition, and the replacement gun barrels to fire indefinitely. When they emerged to fight the Marines, they faced men who were not only physically stronger and better fed, but who arrived with a seemingly unending supply of replacement troops. Every American loss was replaced instantly. Every Japanese loss was final. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the architect of the kamikaze strategy, captured the sense of inevitability in a private note late in the war. The Americans do not fight as men, they fight as machines. When one falls, another steps into the exact same place, carrying the exact same weapon with the exact same orders. Their quantity is their quality. Our devotion is useless against their endless material supply. We have taught our men to die for the emperor. The Americans have mobilized a nation too wealthy to lose. The 296,000 had swelled to over 3 million, and behind those 3 million stood millions more, workers, women, and teenagers, all contributing to the unbroken stream of supply and replacement. The failure of the imperial strategy was the failure to understand that in America, the line between the civilian and the soldier was not a rigid ideological barrier, but a fluid, temporary demarcation, easily dissolved when the nation called. The final crushing realization was that the American war machine was not just fighting for victory, it was fighting to maintain the fundamental economic system, the abundant, consumerist, standardized system that produced its strength. Every bullet, every Liberty ship, every perfectly formed Coca-Cola bottle on a remote beachhead was an assertion of democratic industrial supremacy. 9. Epilogue: The abundance of democracy. The war in the Pacific was ultimately a conflict between two opposing ideas of capacity. The Japanese Empire built a war machine based on maximum effort, finite resources, and the ideology of sacrifice, a system designed to peak early and win decisively before exhaustion. Their strategic ceiling was 296,000 sailors, a number they felt they could withstand and bleed dry. The United States, by contrast, waged war based on total, unfettered capacity, fueled by the inherent, decentralized dynamism of a free market, democratic society. Its ceiling was not 296,000, but the total mobilized population of the continental United States. The true number of sailors, 3 million, was merely the first outpouring of a virtually inexhaustible human reservoir. When the last shots were fired and the long, terrible silence descended across the Pacific, the ruins of the defeated empire bore silent testament to the nature of their fatal misjudgment. They had misread the American character, mistaking peacetime consumerism for weakness and civilian abundance for fragility. They had failed to see that the same societal freedom that allowed millions of people to pursue individual dreams and produce an astonishing variety of goods, symbolized by the casual perfection of the Coca-Cola bottle, was the engine of its ultimate military power. The sailor, often a teenager, pulled from a life of potential leisure and thrown into the belly of an aircraft carrier, was fighting for the right to return to that abundance. His war was not just an ideological crusade, it was a temporary, necessary defense of the very system that made the 296,000 estimate ludicrously small. The great truth revealed by the Pacific War is this: the strength of a free society, its capacity for mobilization, and its enduring will to fight can never be quantified by peacetime statistics. The true measure of its power lies not in the numbers it has now, but in the numbers it can create. It is an abundance that defies mathematical calculation, a power that springs from the very freedom of its citizens, shattering the will of those who mistake efficiency for constraint. The freedom to choose, to create, and to consume is, in the final analysis, the most devastating weapon of all.